Hey, everybody, and welcome to Breaking Biotech, everyone's favorite biotech podcast. My name is Matt, and thanks a lot for coming in today. Hope you're enjoying yourself on this lovely Sunday afternoon. Today, we're going to talk about the Amarin results that came out at the American Heart Association conference last week, and they also published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. So, we're going to talk about all of that, get into all the controversy, and whether or not it's relevant for the approval that they're expecting to get with their supplemental NDA application that should be filed soon. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk about, fish oil, all different things fish oil, and then just finish up with a quick portfolio wrap up, and I'll leave you to it. So for those who need a background on Amarin, you should really watch my other video, and I'll link to it in the comments and probably put a card up. But there I go through a little bit more of the details of the background. But just to give a quick review, so Amarin, they've been around for a while, and the reason that they've been at around $3 and $2 is because the FDA originally said that in order for them to get the indication on their Vascepa medication, this EPA concentrated fish oil pill, they needed to do a cardiovascular outcome study to show that this pill actually did have an effect on major cardiovascular outcomes. So we see here from 2012 to 2014, they finished up their phase 3 trials, Amarin and Anchor, and showed that there was a benefit they showed that it reduced triglycerides, but they needed a longer term study to really show whether or not there was an effect on MACE events. And when that happened, the stock dropped to about 1 or 2, and it's taken them, years to come up with the CVOT study to show that in fact their Vascepa medication did have an effect on reducing cardiovascular outcomes. So we see here last week the AHA was definitely a sell the news event, and there was also some rumors going around that they were going to have a secondary offering, so everybody sold off in anticipation of that. The raise of capital didn't come in, and it's been slowly being bought back up. So it looks like we're finding some support around 16, but who knows? It's going to continue to be volatile, but we'll get into that. So, yeah. So the study that they released is a nice article that goes through the data. It shows, the main outcomes here, and just to recap a little bit, their Vascepa medication, it's a 1-gram pill that is EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, ethyl ester, and I think I'm saying that right. And of the omega-3s, that one along with DHA are the major omega-3 fatty acids that are claimed to have some sort of beneficial effects. Now, the DHA specific effects don't seem to be as helpful as the EPA effects. So, and there's been trials that have looked at specifically the DHA or just the mixed amount of fish oils, but EPA really seems to be the one that has an effect here. So they looked at patients. They did 8,000 patients and treated with placebo, or 4,000 treated with placebo, 4,000 treated with Vascepa, and they looked and saw whether or not one group had fewer major cardiovascular outcomes. So what they ended up finding, I'll get to it here. So baseline, and these are all patients that have been treated with statins. So their LDL-C is very well controlled, although there's a little bit of a caveat to that when it comes to the mineral oil and the placebo. So we can see here that most of them, I think the average triglyceride level was between 150 and 300. So I think like 250 was the average triglyceride. And so they were able to show a benefit before that if they had over 500 milligrams per deciliter triglycerides, Vascepa really had an effect in helping these patients, but it was a little bit more nuanced when it came to people that had only above 150 milligram per deciliter triglycerides. So this is the data for the primary endpoint. So the primary endpoint, they looked at cardiovascular death, nonfatal myocardial infarct, nonfatal stroke, coronary revascularization, and unstable angina. So the number of these events in this primary endpoint, they saw that eicosapent ethyl reduced the hazard ratio by about 25. So you're 25% less likely to have an event if you are in the eicosapent ethyl group. And eicosapent ethyl refers to the EPA, the Vascepa drug. And this is compared to placebo here. And we can see the 95% confidence interval. It's relatively tight. So the drug does have efficacy in this area. If we look at the secondary endpoint, which is just the cardiovascular death and non-fatal infarct or stroke, we see hazard ratio at 0.74, so like a 26% reduced chance of having one of these events. So this is very positive. I think it's in line with what we were expecting. We can look into some of the details here where they break down the variables of the patients to see what had what was responsible or what wasn't responsible for this effect. And some of the things of note that are kind of interesting in terms of just trying to understand what this drug does. And so one of the critiques of it is that there's not really a mechanism that's understood here. And it's a valid critique because if you look at a breakdown, okay, we're going to go through my myriad of tabs here. So in their supplementals, they actually show whether or not after 1 year, what happened to all of these patients. And when we see that here, we can see that patients that had either below 150 milligram per deciliter triglyceride or above 150 milligram per deciliter triglyceride, they still ended up seeing an effect of icosapent ethyl. So it didn't matter what the triglycerides were, which seems to suggest that the triglyceride lowering mechanism that they originally proposed isn't necessarily what's going on in these patients. So this is interesting from a scientific perspective because the omega-3 fatty acids, a lot of effects have been attributed to them. And in the discussion of the paper, they talk about how there's a blood thinning effect that can go on with these. There's an anti-inflammatory effect of the omega-3s, and there's also this triglyceride lowering thing. So it's likely to be a combination of all of these different things. And in terms of FDA approval, many drugs have been approved without knowing the mechanism of action, so I don't think it's going to be a hurdle in that respect. I think it's gonna open some new avenues of research just to see what's going on here, but I don't think it's going to be a huge hurdle for the company to get approval, given that the effect that they see is so dramatic. So this is particularly interesting, I find. They also talk about plaque stability. So one of the things that causes these MACE events is rupture of an atherosclerotic plaque in the vessel, and omega-3s have been shown to have a stabilizing role in those plaques that form, and could be a mechanism that leads to improvement in these MACE events. So there's a lot of questions about the mechanism, and definitely future studies should look at it, but in terms of approval for the company, I don't think it's a huge problem. So the other thing that was particularly interesting, actually you don't really see it in the main data. You have to go to the supplement. So in the supplemental data, they show all the different markers that they looked at. And I'm going to get to that right now, eventually. Okay, so here we go. So in the supplement, they showed the difference between baseline in each group, and they showed the difference between the groups here, which is pretty cool. So triglycerides, we can see in the Vascepa group, they got a 21% decrease in triglycerides, which is good. In the placebo, they still saw a 6% decrease in triglycerides, which is interesting. And then they saw the difference between the groups is about 14%. So the drug had a bigger effect in reducing triglycerides, but whether or not Vascepa has a primary effect on triglycerides or something else is a little bit in question. Now, something that was noticed by a lot of people was the difference in LDL-C. So both groups of patients are on a statin therapy that controls their LDL-C very well. But one of the things that the FDA and the company agreed upon is that as a control in the placebo, they would add mineral to it to give it the same kind of look as the Vascepa drug. So the problem with mineral oil is that there's other papers that have shown that high doses of mineral oil can actually lead to a reduced absorption of certain drugs like statins. So mineral oil could have had an effect on statin absorption in the placebo group that they didn't see in the Vascepa group. So some of the difference, the final difference that they see, might be due to a reduced efficacy of statins in the placebo group. So that's had some people raising their eyebrows and asking whether or not that could have been the cause of this result. But like a lot of people have talked about, and a lot of editorials have gone on, that they bring up a lot of these issues that I'm bringing up now, One was here. Some of the big biotech commentators already talked about it, but that reducing. So I'll tell you the difference right now. So LDL-C increased in the Vascepa group by 3%, but in the placebo group it increased by 10%. So there's like a 3 times difference in change of LDL-C comparing the two groups. But if you look at the absolute difference at the end, it's 84 versus 77. But things that we have grown to learn is that if you reduce LDL-C substantially, which they saw in the PCSK9 trials, you do get an improved reduction in these cardiovascular outcomes. So, a difference in 5 would lead to something like a 5% relative risk reduction, though, and it wouldn't account for the entire 25% that the study saw. So if there is a role here of mineral oil, it would be relatively minimal in the results that they see here, but it is something that that should be noted. And I think, the FDA should not let trials use mineral oil when it comes to statins. And, the FDA actually allowed them to use mineral oil in the phase 3 trials that they did, that Amarin did too. So it's kind of a thing that's been going on for a while now, and it obviously should stop so that it's no longer a confounding factor here. But I don't think it's a serious concern for the company, because everybody kind of knows what they would have expected or what they would have seen in the placebo group had there not been any mineral oil. And on top of that, which other people have brought up, the JELIS study that occurred in Japan did not use mineral oil, and they saw a 19% improvement right here using their EPA drug. So it's relatively in line with the REDUCE-IT study from Amarin, which is good to see. Yes. So that was another concern that people had, and I obviously don't think it's going to be a hurdle for the company. I think it's easily explainable, especially since they've already had an agreement with the FDA for that. But along with this, they saw things like the C-reactive protein. They saw a huge difference of 40% between this and the Vascepa drug, and they've seen this effect in their phase 3 trials. So Vascepa might have a primary effect here, but the mechanism still is unknown. But it makes you wonder if there might be some effect of the mineral oil that does this. But I think also this is relatively easy to explain away, and I still think that the results are very strong here. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to touch on those. And in terms of like overall impact this has, I think this is a pretty interesting, solid case for EPA having a role in cardiovascular outcomes. There's been some studies in the past that looked at, actually some systematic reviews that looked at 10 trials with all of these people at the effects of omega-3, and they saw no change in MACE events. But these trials, of course, it wasn't just EPA, it was DHA, and sometimes it was even just mixed omega-3 fatty acids. But it really looks like it's the EPA that's important. And if we look here, this is just from the Amarin presentation, comparing the relative risk reduction here. So Lavazza showed nothing significant in their trial, which is a mixture, and then so then EPA itself, you get this nice effect. So all of the supplements that are available over the counter, usually they're a mixture of omega-3, and then they have some proportion of it that they guarantee is EPA or DHA. But it really seems like those are kind of a waste of money, and that it's the EPA itself that you want to focus on. And it's going to be neat to see whether or not some supplement companies try to just concentrate EPA and put that in a pill and start selling it to people. But EPA, or the Vascepa drug itself, isn't crazy expensive, and fish oil pills themselves are kind of expensive. So it's going to be neat to see how the market develops, even though Amarin does have a patent on EPA. And I haven't looked at the patent, but the patent is enforceable, and they actually settled with Teva, a generic manufacturer, to allow them to release the drug not until 2029. So Amarin's going to have a relative lock on the technology, on the EPA, concentrated EPA. But I wonder if some supplement companies might try to undercut it. It's not a huge risk in my opinion, but it'll be neat to see if Amarin's going to have to really enforce their patent in court. So it's also funny that PCSK9 inhibitors. They had a rough go of it given their crazy price tag. They originally came out with like 14 grand per year, and a lot of companies have reduced that price. But I think a yearly supply of Vascepa is something like $3,000, maybe even less with some coupons or something like that. So it's going to be tough for PCSK9 inhibitors to be competitive in this area, even though they do show a relative risk reduction of 15%. So it's too bad, but that's how it goes. Okay, so other than that, yeah, so right. So the cheapness, yeah. So Vascepa's it's been out on the market for a while now, so I think it's going to be a very low bar of entry for doctors to actually prescribe it, which is good. And they've waited a long time to try and really open up to the market of patients that are on statins. So last time I talked about Amarin, I had this graph here that I did a slight update to, but I still think it holds water. So the max revenue they could get, all patients that are that have hypertriglyceridemia, it's something like 50 million people, and this is from their material here. But if they were able to get all of those patients, and not all those patients are on statins, so the indication is only going to be for patients who have well-controlled LDL-C. I see share price something like 80. I think it's I adjusted that from before, which is like 100 or something. If they just reach half of statin patients, I see price target around $44. But of course, this is going to take a long time to get. They're going to have to get a sales force together, and they're going to have to really push for it. And they have 10 years before before Teva can come in and undercut them. The other thing is AstraZeneca has a product that's a concentrated EPA pill, and the results from that shouldn't come out until 2020. So Amarin will have the lock on the market until around that time, and it'll take some time for them to get regulatory approval. But it's going to be a battle for Amarin to go out there and get it. But there's been a ton of hype on this product, and I know personally I've received so many like bots that have come at me telling me that the Amarin study is just a joke. So somebody's kind of behind trying to spread some fear about and uncertainty about the product itself, which I find is kind of interesting. Somebody must have a short position somewhere, but I think the company has a lot of success ahead of them. So I'm I bought in on the dip towards 15, and I'm gonna hold for quite a while because I don't think there's a lot of huge catalysts coming up. So it's going to be a definite long-term hold for me. And speaking of catalysts, so here's the things to look forward to. So they are looking for expanded indication because the drug is already approved for patients that are on statins but have a high triglyceride, so above 500 milligrams per deciliter. And they're going to get approval. Well, they're hoping to get approval for patients who have higher than 150 milligrams per deciliter, which is the huge market that I mentioned. But approval isn't going to come until late 2019. So there is some time before then, and in that time, they're definitely going to try to expand their sales team, try to get doctors and patients educated on it, and also look for expansion into other markets. So this could be pretty huge, but they're definitely going to have to put some work into it to get it to deliver on what we expect, because this is a lot of revenue that they would bring in, and they have the potential to do it, but they got to really work for it. So I'm going to hold for quite a while, and I think that they're going to be good company to have. So with that, let me know if you have any questions, if you think I missed anything here, and I'm happy to field questions related to what I think about Amarin. And so my position in Amarin isn't that huge. I think I have 50 shares. Average cost is like 16 or 17. So yeah, so we'll go from there. But anyway, quick portfolio wrap up. So Madrigal and Viking, they took a serious hit after all their data came out because they each had like an AHA seminar or something, and Madrigal took a gigantic hit, whereas Viking wasn't as bad. But I've been adding Viking for quite a while, but I did add some Madrigal when it went under the price that I actually paid for it. So kind of crazy that they're both like pre-data levels now, but the NASH market is gigantic, and the market is seriously undervaluing the amount of money that these two companies are going to be able to bring in, even though they're not quite yet ready for regulatory approval. But I don't think Intercept took a hit as much as I think they should, given the data from Magical and Viking. I don't know why the market is valuing Intercept so much. Maybe just because they're further along in the pipeline. But both Viking and Magical look like they have a ton of potential. So otherwise, Esperion went back down to, it was looking pretty good around $60, and then the market, the Esperion market itself kind of went down. So it got hammered, but I still think they're good. Otherwise, so Sangamo, their delay in data really shook the market. They went down to like $9, and there's a lot of controversy on whether or not their product is real. If you're going to delay data, it'd be nice if you had a good reason for it, but they didn't really say anything about that. So, I'm still holding on to them because I think their product still works, but, until we see the data, it's going to be a bit of a toss-up. So, we'll see. But otherwise, overall, I'm still kind of in line with the S&P 500. My portfolio, when I started doing this, it wasn't really fair because I'm comparing it to the year-to-date of the XBI, whereas, I didn't start at 0 at the beginning of the year. So when we get to 2019, I'm going to revamp this whole thing and, have a cash position that I haven't really been talking about. So my portfolio here isn't like, it doesn't make necessarily good sense to compare it to the XBI or SP 500. So that's going to change in the new year. But, until then, I'm relatively in line with the S&P 500. And but hopefully the XBI can bounce back from their recent turmoil. In terms of volatility, we're still like higher than the average volatility. So, expect a lot of things to go on, a lot of big swings. But it has cooled off in the last little while. And if we look at the XBI, actually, we hit a support of around 94-ish. And we had a good bounce from that. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not it tests this again, or it tests this and goes lower, or we test it and continue to get some inflows, which I think I saw on somebody's Twitter that this week was one of a good week for inflows for the sector. So that's a good sign. Anyway, with that, we're going to wrap it up. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, or leave me a comment. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.